But during the 1970s, Stan Peters took over as president, and he really kind of shifted that union's focus from just being an advocate for police officers' rights in the workplace to really kind of becoming a political force within the city that had significant influence over the different policies that would affect how policing was done in Portland. The Portland Police Association under Stan Peters' regime took a hardline stance against any reforms. They became really active in different political campaigns, giving money and throwing their weight and support behind different candidates for city council office. They were part of an overall national movement which was called the Blue Power Movement, and it was kind of a backlash of police against the criticisms of the Black Power movement. And part of what the Portland Police Association did was they would file civil lawsuits against people who had resisted arrest and an officer got injured. That was one of the things that they were doing that other police unions found really exciting and saw that as a part of the forefront of the Blue Power movement. They also filed suit on policy issues, so they filed suit to stop affirmative action policies that were happening within the Portland Police Bureau at that time. So the backlash, the reforms that were ineffective, and then the backlash that was sparked by the Portland Police Association created another wave of community movements for police reforms. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Black United Front became an active organization here in Portland, and their two primary demands were to change the one-way segregation policies within Portland public schools, and also to take on some of the disproportionate arrest and imprisonment rates of blacks here in Portland. At that time, blacks in Multnomah County were arrested at 5 times the rates of whites, which even exceeded the 3 times national rate. Oregon and Washington at that time had the most disproportionate rates of imprisonment of black men in the nation. So the Pacific Northwest was really kind of stood out in terms of racial profiling within the criminal justice system. And the way in which the Black United Front decided to try to change things was to appeal to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And in 1981, they filed a complaint with the United Nations Human Rights Commission and asked them to come and investigate in Portland. The Human Rights Commission receives hundreds of thousands of complaints every year, and they decided not to investigate the one that was filed by the Black United Front. During that time, too, Charles Jordan was elected as the first black city commissioner, and when he was put on the city council, one of the bureaus that he was in charge of, he became the commissioner of police. He went out of his way in the beginning of his term to really kind of appeal to Stan Peters and to listen to the Portland Police Association and to try to kind of bend over backwards and find out what it was that police officers wanted. He knew that as a black commissioner, he was going to face some resistance from the Portland Police Association. He really went out of his way to try to find common ground with them. However, when he began to criticize the civil service exam and say that it wasn't fair to non-white potential police hirees, and he wanted to change that examination, that's when the Portland Police Association really began to see Charles Jordan as an enemy. And so during that time, he really started pushing for reforms. And he created a citizens task force to study the internal affairs department and see if that was an effective or not an effective way for citizens to file complaints. In 1981, just a few months after the Black United Front filed a complaint with the United Nations Human Rights Commission, a popular black-owned restaurant called the Burger Barn in the middle of the night found dead possums dropped on their doorstep. And witnesses to that event said that there had been 4 police cars in their parking lot and 7 officers, and 2 officers were identified as having dropped those dead possums on the front doorstep of the Burger Barn. The community was outraged by this racist attack, and they held rallies and protests and asked the city council to do something about that. They wanted the 2 officers who were involved, Officers Ward and Galloway, to be fired. Charles Jordan said, hey, let's let the internal affairs department do their job and see what happens, but community pressure became too much, and he eventually fired Ward and Galloway. Well, that sparked a backlash, as we've seen this kind of constant cycle of resistance, reform, and then backlash to reform. That happened in this case too. And the Portland Police Association took a vote of no confidence against Charles Jordan, against the mayor, against Chief Baker, and then they organized and held a rally called Cops Have Rights to Rally, where 1,000 police marched in downtown Portland. As a result of that Cops Have Rights to rally, Mayor Evanci took control of the police department out from Charles Jordan's purview and put it under his own purview. Charles Jordan basically commented saying that what is happening here, Stan Peters is basically running the city, and that was the president of the Portland Police Association. When Evanci took control of the police bureau, he changed things, and a lot of those reforms that had happened kind of moved backwards. He hired a new chief, Ron Still, who had been involved in some of the disruption of the Black Panther Party breakfast program, and he had also been involved in some of the scandals that had plagued the police department in the late 1970s. And one of the first actions that happened was the Portland Police Association appealed the firing of Ward and Galloway, who were involved in the possum incident, and an arbitrator ruled that they had to be reinstated, so they got their jobs back. During that time, too, while Ward and Galloway were fired, they were still earning a living. The Portland Police Association hired them and paid them their equivalent salaries and gave them jobs on their newspaper. However, Charles Jordan's reforms were still going on because that task force continued to meet, and they were charged with coming up with a way to provide some oversight to the internal affairs process. And they came up with a proposal to have a committee called the Police Internal Investigations Auditing Committee, or PIIAC, and that committee would provide some sort of oversight and review of the cases that the Internal Affairs Commission reviewed. The City Council approved the establishment of PIIAC, and then the Portland Police Association sponsored a ballot measure to actually put this up for vote among the city and to have a referendum as to whether or not PIIAC would be established. They put it to a citywide vote and it barely passed. This was the first iteration of civilian review, but PIIAC had such a narrow scope that it was basically ineffective. All they could do, they couldn't investigate anything, they couldn't call witnesses. All they could do was review the cases that the Internal Affairs Division had reviewed, and then they could make a recommendation or a suggestion to Internal Affairs that, okay, we'll send this back to you, maybe you should reinvestigate it, but it had no teeth to it at all. So by 1987, after being in existence for 5 years, only 2 of their 28 recommendations had been followed. And this is a continuing theme in the struggle to get civilian oversight of the Portland Police Department, that every single committee that exists really doesn't have the power to do the job, an effective job of civilian oversight. In 1985, we close this chapter of Portland history with, just as it began with the death of Cletus Rhodes, it closes in 1985 with the death of Tony Stevenson. He was an off-duty security guard and a former Marine who had gone to a convenience store one night to get food for his kids. And while he was there was an altercation. Somebody came in and got in an argument with the clerk at the store, and Tony Stevenson helped the clerk subdue this man and hold him until the police could arrive. When the police arrived, it was Tony Stevenson that they targeted, and Officer Gary Barber put him in a chokehold and basically choked him to death. After that incident happened, again, this sparked community outrage and protest, and Chief Penny Harrington banned the use of a chokehold by officers. As a result of that, that also provoked some backlash. And officers created t-shirts that said, "Smoke 'em, don't choke 'em," and they printed those up and they began selling them on the day of Tony Stevenson's funeral. Both of those incidents caused more protest and outrage, so not only the death of Tony Stevenson, but also the printing of those t-shirts and the selling of those t-shirts. And officers Monty and Wickersham, who had printed up those t-shirts, were initially fired, and then again the Portland Police Association appealed their firing to a state arbitrator, and they were reinstated. They lost 6 months' pay. Tony Stevenson's death, for the first time since 1974, and the death of Ricky Charles Jordan, there was a public inquest held, which is basically like a public trial. And the purpose of the inquest in the 1974 case was to determine whether or not that case should go to a grand jury. In this case, there was a public inquest held, but it would have the results of the inquest would not be any action brought against a police officer. Basically, the result of the inquest could not be used in any further court proceedings, but there was basically a trial held where the death of Tony Stevenson was looked at and a jury made a decision, and they proclaimed that the death was homicide. But that would have no bearing upon the grand jury process where Officer Barber was found to have not committed a crime. Later, Tony Stevenson's family would sue the city and would have one of the largest settlements up until that time. I think there's been larger ones since, of I think $600,000 that the city would have to pay out for wrongful death. So throughout our entire study period, let's go back to those 3 demands that the community was asking for. From the death of Cleotis Rhodes up until the death of Tony Stevenson, there was very little progress made in terms of trying to end police brutality and harassment. No officers were held accountable for deaths at all during that time. There was slightly more progress made on the civilian oversight front. In 1964, there was no way for a civilian to file a complaint against the police, and at least with the establishment of internal affairs, there was a way that you could file a complaint, even if that complaint wouldn't necessarily go anywhere. So there wasn't an effective civilian oversight panel that was established, but at least there was a mechanism for civilians to be able to file a complaint. And then in terms of affirmative action, in this study period, we aren't seeing much of a diversification of the police force, but since that time, there has been more affirmative action within the Portland Police Bureau. So what lessons have we learned from looking at this history and looking at where we are today? What we've learned by looking at the interaction between movements for reforms, sparking backlash, sparking more movements for reform, sparking backlash, we saw that every attempt at reform was met with resistance by the police and often by the city, too. The intelligence unit during the 1960s and then later in the 1970s and 80s, the police union were used to try to bully activists that were trying to get reforms from the police. And city officials would often back down whenever there was any sort of backlash from officials within the Portland Police or from the Portland Police Union. And police reform was never a high priority for elected officials. It wasn't something that they would necessarily run for their council positions on. It was something that they had to take up because the community forced them to take these issues up. We also discovered that the most progress was made when there was outside pressure or oversight. So all those reforms that happened in the 1970s were really a result of the Probasco decree by having a court-ordered consent agreement take place. And even the U.S. Department of Justice coming to town, even though they didn't find a pattern and practice of civil rights violations, and even though the United Nations never investigated that complaint, just having some sort of outside force force the city to take these issues seriously was very effective. And so when we look at police-community relations today, despite the fact that gentrification has occurred, despite the fact that African Americans are now more dispersed around the city, this notion of an internal colony is still relevant today. Many people still feel as though they're under occupation, and there remains this tension within the community between wanting public safety, yet fearing the police and fearing racial profiling. Politicians are the ones that we discovered in our study were the ones that actually have the power to make reforms. So they're the ones that also have the responsibility to make sure that these reforms take place. And it's when outside oversight happens that these politicians are actually held accountable, and that ensures that reform will happen. However, it takes community pressure to get there. So those reforms didn't kind of come out of nowhere. It came from people organizing and people mobilizing to try to make some sort of change. To politicians never having police reform as part of their platform here in Portland. And even today, the city recently filed suit to not have to have a judge oversee their agreement that they're implementing with the Department of Justice. The fact that the findings that we found that when an outside agency kind of forces the city, that's when change actually gets made. So what we're seeing happen today is the exact opposite of what we found in the paper. So I would encourage everybody here to contact your city council people and to encourage them to not file that suit and to pull that suit so that we can have a judge hold us accountable and make sure that those reforms that are supposed to be instituted by the Department of Justice agreement that's happening right now are instituted.
I think troubling for a lot of people who want to be supportive both of organized labor and of communities that are experiencing police oppression, which is that the police union was actually behind a lot of the resistance to transparency, to fairness, to justice in the Black community.
There was a time at which the police union organized a protest in response to one of these, attempts to be held accountable. And as a union, they did, with Stan Peters, they marched on the waterfront. And yes, the waterfront workers organized with them. Yeah. So police unions, actually, that's another subject of investigation that should happen, because this is an issue. On the one hand, you want employee protection, and of course, police are putting their lives on the line. But on the other hand, like Charles Jordan said at the time, that the police are not like any other government agency. There needs to be more accountability if you're going to be in the police force. So the fact that they're organized to always protect themselves against any kind of backlash, it becomes an issue.
Organizing on the waterfront was to get a collective bargaining agreement. So the police couldn't strike and couldn't picket, so they did pickets around the waterfront ports, and the longshoremen won't cross picket lines. So that was the way that they pressured the city to get a collective bargaining agreement. But yes, there's a need for all workers to be organized and to have organizations to look out for your rights and your responsibilities in the workplace. However, what we've seen with the Portland Police Union, as Karen's alluding to, is it's kind of overstepping that purpose and really becoming an organization that's kind of pressuring the city, and an anti-reform organization. It would make police officers' jobs a lot safer if there were some sort of civilian oversight, because some of these tensions between the police and the community might dissipate if there were some sort of effective accountability or oversight. So it isn't necessarily in the interest of police officers to always have a union that's anti-reform, but it might be better served by protecting people's rights and responsibilities within the workplace by being in favor of accountability and transparency.
It's not pertinent exactly to today, the research that you did, but I'm wondering, you did notice structures and cycles and patterns, and given what you've learned, what would you say to those of us at Portland State today who are considering having sworn police force on our campus?
Yeah, I actually would say it is quite pertinent to today, and this is why history is such an important lens for understanding where we are today. The point of the paper was that we haven't changed much. And this, like Leanne was saying, the idea, I'll get to PSU, but the idea that the city council are refusing to have judge oversight, what does that say? It's only with outside intervention that the city has been able to make progress. So to me, the arrogance in the face of people, mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers losing loved ones constantly by mistakes. We cannot pretend. This doesn't always happen intentionally, but people make mistakes. And people die because of those mistakes. Police are human. And the criminal justice research shows that racial perceptions, racial stereotypes are behind some of these snap judgment thinking, okay? So it is very pertinent to today, and that is why, yes, I voted against having our police armed.
Hi, so Karen, you know me. I'm the mayor's wife, and your comment about politicians being held accountable, I have to say, that's the right comment. And I think the past does inform the present. Clearly, your program affirms that there's a combination of reform and then backlash and reform and backlash. So I'm not my husband, but I campaigned with him for 2.5 years, and he campaigned on police reform. And I would argue that that was part of the reason he was elected. Fast forward, there has been a DOJ settlement that has been approved by the Department of Justice. There have been 4 politicians who said, we want to be responsible for that responsibility. That there has been now a recent employment of a compliance officer. There has been the announcement of a new police chief. All of these, to me, are indications that we're in the process of progression. How do you advise us, if the past informs the future, to assure that all these good things that are in fact happening right now in our city don't go back? And I would argue very strongly that the City Council should be responsible for the DOJ settlement. And the City Council is in fact doing all the things that the DOJ settlement required. So again, help us with that, because we're almost 30 years forward at this point.
There's a hand in the back, and I think it might be a response to that.
Great, okay.
From the Albina Minister Coalition for Justice and Police Reform, the things that the city is doing, some of them are good. The majority of them, as they stated, and we agree, are smack in the face of the community, ignoring 4 politicians, are ignoring a lot of what the city is saying. Yes, we got a new police chief, but we had no public input or discussion or search. He was named. Yes, we got a settlement agreement. People in the room know that we worked and argued for months to reach that agreement. And on the 9th hour or the 12th hour, before it was time to run out, we then get the city who says to us, we want to do a limited appeal as to what the judge means by evidence. But clearly in these council meetings, and clearly now, as we can see from the appeal papers being put forward, they are questioning whether the judge has the right to even call for such an oversight in a hearing. If that's forward progress, you have to convince me that is moving backwards. This is nothing that one in the room knows. We've clearly stated, we're clearly continuing to articulate, it's not moving us forward. That is a slap in the face, and it's moving backwards. I know today that on the City Council agenda is a recommendation to hire a COCA, a community compliance officer and a community liaison. Everyone on the selection committee that interviewed said that this group should not be hired. And yet, on Monday night, when youth said, you didn't listen to us, Amanda Fritz said, we considered what you said, but we just don't think it's right. So if you're moving forward for progress to help your city, if you ignore what folks say to you, what is that saying? That says to us, you really don't care what we say. We're going to do what we want to do. And the pattern, as I watch this and listen to you present today, is the same old soup warmed over, because the same old stuff is still happening today. Come after me if you will, with comments and all of that kind of stuff I'm talking about. But you got to understand, for the sake of the community and a lot of people, this is not good for us at all.
Two things that I want to address, specifically regarding the DOJ agreement, which AMAC signed on to also. The Police Bureau and the city have been implementing the measures that are required in that agreement ahead of schedule. Regarding the appeal, the agreement, it's not a consent decree. A lot of people think that the Police Bureau and the city fought DOJ in court about saying there was nothing wrong. They actually came to a settlement agreement recognizing there were lots of improvements that the Police Bureau could make. The Police Bureau has been actively implementing those reforms. I love community input. I love community pressure. It's what's got us where we are. It's what brought DOJ to town in the first place. The DOJ agreement is actually really good. I invite people to read it. There's a lot of reform in it that is actually taking place. So that's my thoughts. Sorry.
You don't have a question?
I'd just like to say that if the city is truly interested in implementing reform, what harm does it do to have that outside oversight? I attended some of the two-day hearings that Judge Simon held when the agreement was being implemented, and there were so many people that wanted to come and testify about that they had to open a second courtroom, and that Judge Simon patiently listened to every single community member that had come to tell their stories because they felt like their stories weren't necessarily represented in that particular agreement. So I think having some sort of outside oversight ensures us that the voices that may not be being heard are going to be heard. And if the city is truly interested, and I know it's exciting to see the fact that there are people within the police department, I think now more than ever, kind of pushing for those reforms within the police bureau too. I mean, that is part of that story that didn't necessarily get told in the 10,000 words that we had for Auditing and Serbulo quarterly, but I think that's a wave of reform that's happening as well. So it's exciting to see that happening, but I think if we're truly interested in reform, there's no harm in having an outside agency hold us accountable.
You know, it's interesting because, I completely agree. It's, what is the harm in it? And so what we do with politicians, Dr. Laura Haynes, Dr. Bethel's colleague, we had interviewed in 2012 as we were finishing up this article. I asked him, what did he think? How does it apply to today? And he said it comes down to the politicians. The politicians have to have the courage and the fortitude. So we know what we do with politicians that don't do what we want. So young activists, you hold your politicians accountable. That's what needs to happen.